Hello and welcome. My name is Douglas Kelmer, and I'm president of US ICOMOS, the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. This webinar is one in a series that we will be conducting on a regular basis. In these, we will examine the intersection of world heritage with the rapidly changing world in which we live. Every few days now, we are confronted with multiple events that in the recent past would have been considered appalling. I am reminded of a three-ring circus, that 19th century invention credited to Barnum and Bailey. What goes on in one ring amazes the onlookers until their attention is drawn to a second ring with something equally difficult to ignore. Then there's a third ring. And of course, there are clowns. And while the public cannot look away from the daily spectacles, there are many developments and events that once might have generated great condemnation. There is simply not enough airtime to examine them in depth, to consider long-term consequences. Environmental regulations are weakened. National monuments that were intended to provide environmental connectivity over large areas and to discourage access to pristine archaeological sites and sites sacred to Native Americans are broken into pieces. And World Heritage Sites, including the Chaco Culture National Historical Park World Heritage Site, which includes not just Chaco Canyon, but also some of the magnificent outlier structures, also the Grand Canyon, and many others under threat from developments that would impair their beauty and denigrate their authenticity and integrity. These developments further disenfranchise Native American groups from their homelands, and they deny economic benefits that should accrue to local communities through thoughtful interpretation and provision of services. So one desired outcome of our US ICOMOS webinar series is to draw attention to the human costs associated with the degradation of World Heritage Sites in the United States. And with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Ernie Atencio, who is Southwest Regional Director of the National Parks and Conservation Association. Welcome to you all. Welcome, Ernie. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and hello, everyone. And welcome to this third US ICOMOS webinar, World Heritage Site at Risk, Chaco Culture National Historical Park. Again, as Doug mentioned, my name is Ernie Atencio. I'm the Southwest Regional Director for National Parks Conservation Association. Our region includes all of the Four Corners states. I live near Taos, New Mexico, and in addition to my work with NPCA to protect parks, I have a background in anthropology. I worked as a ranger at Mesa Verde National Park for several seasons, and I've been visiting Chaco since the early 80s. So this is a place that is personally very special to me. Over the next hour, you will be hearing from experts in the field with extensive knowledge and unique perspectives about Chaco, including Kurt Reilly, who is a Puebloan tribal leader, Paul Reed, a preservation archaeologist with Archaeology Southwest, and myself. You all will be muted and your videos are off so that you'll only see the panel of speakers, but there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience following the presentations. Please use the Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions for our panelists, and we will do our best to get to all of them. Okay, with that, it is my honor to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Kurt Reilly. Kurt is a Puebloan tribal leader who recently completed his third term as the appointed governor of the Pueblo of Akama. He has also served as chairman of the 10 Southern Pueblo Council of Governors, co-chair of the All Pueblo Council of Governors Natural Resources and Health Committees, and we are privileged that he serves on NPCA's Southwest Regional Advisory Council. Kurt will speak about the cultural significance of Chaco, both to Puebloan people and to the outstanding universal values that it represents to the world's heritage. And now I will hand it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Ernie. Watsi hopa. Kai hopa tawatsi kash kai kayutse. To hin the mesh dish atsayo sha chano dish. Kuhimati kai hopa tawa hawitsi. Skau iskayo iskayish kemish. Kutuna atashti skautani. Etima hawitsi tawatsi dietsi tuwa. Good morning, everyone. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today to speak to all of you. I wish I could see your faces, but you heard me speak in my language, the Akama language, and that's a traditional greeting that all speakers usually follow when they are presenting in front of individuals such as like yourselves. Basically, what I said is, my Akama name is Atsaya. I was named after a flowering bush that flowers early in spring. Given that I was born in March, I'm a member of the Akama Sun Clan, one of the original clans of the Akama people. And from my father, I am also a child of the sun from the Laguna Pueblo. First of all, I want to thank U.S. ICOMOS for inviting me to speak on this panel. And I will begin by very briefly telling you a little bit, for those of you that don't know New Mexico. There are 19 pueblos in the state of New Mexico, 3 Apache tribes, 2 are federally recognized, and 1 is state recognized. There's also, of course, Navajo Nation. There are 7 distinct languages spoken by these Pueblo tribes and nations with various dialects. Akama is a Keres Pueblo, and so we do understand some of the other Keres-speaking Pueblos here in New Mexico. From the Pueblos' perspective, we all have, and I would have to include Pueblos, tribes, and nations within the U.S. Every community has a history or a story that is told of their emergence onto solid ground. Akama is no different. We emerged to this world from sheep up. And our oral history tells us that we migrated from somewhere in the north to where we are presently located, somewhat in the middle of New Mexico. And over that course of time, we are told that our people, our ancestral people, settled in various places, searching for their homeland. As I used to tell the children of the Akama community when I spoke to them, science is now proving that our oral history is true. It is not just Chaco Canyon. It is not just Mesa Verde, Salmon Ruins, but even now, today, Bears Ears now proves that our oral history is true. How much further north do we have to travel to see evidence of Pueblo occupation? Getting back to Chaco Canyon is a place that was important then to Pueblo people and is important now. Just because our ancestors left doesn't mean that it is no longer utilized or it's dead. To Pueblo people, they pilgrimage back to these sites, these ancestral sites. We believe our ancestral spirits are still there. And it is not just Chaco Canyon proper, but it's also the surrounding communities. You see a picture of Akama on the screen. Akama is the ancestral and current home of Akama people. But in the valley below, there are sites that we visit. And much like Chaco, as was said before, it is not just the archaeological ruins, to quote one of the lawyers of Akama. All archaeological sites are sacred, but not all sacred sites are archaeological. And so with the recent decision by this administration to open up oil and gas development as close as possible sometimes through oil and gas leasing of federal lands, it creates a threat not only to Chaco, the archaeological site, but to the sacred sites that surround Chaco proper and its archaeological sites. I think Paul Reed, who will follow me, will point that fact out. Here is an alleyway, a winter view. It might have snowed. We have recently had snow here in New Mexico, but I don't think it went that south. This is an alleyway that's close to my home up on top of Akama. And so you can imagine what it might have looked like back in the day when Chaco was populated. And so the El Pueblo Council of Governors, while I was in office, have taken various stands. They have submitted written documents. They have testified at various forums and have asked that these parcels be correctly evaluated, not only for cultural sites, but also looking at the environmental impact upon the land and its resources, its animals, and including the people who live there. Chaco Canyon is surrounded by Navajo Nation reservation and Navajo Nation individual Alaki land. As you will see later on during Paul's presentation, the extent of oil and gas development that has already happened cannot be visualized from the ground. You have to get up into the air to see the true magnitude of oil and gas development that's already occurring around Chaco Canyon. But why would the El Pueblo Council be so adamant about reevaluating these leases? I myself have gone on pilgrimages during my office and throughout my lifetime to these sacred sites. We often have to work with BLM, US Forest Service, to obtain permission to access these sacred sites. Long before state lines were drawn, fences were put up as signs of ownership. Pueblo people used to migrate back and forth and pilgrimage back and forth between these sites. And so now with all of these rules, regulations, permissions, it becomes a hardship for Pueblo people to return back to these sacred sites. And so I will be brief in my opening comments, but what I would like to say is that Chaco is still alive. It was important then. It is still important to Pueblo people today. And I hope that you will join us in submitting comments to the federal government to delay the further leasing of parcels of land under the direction of the Bureau of Land Management. With that, thank you for listening to me. It has been a pleasure to speak to you, and I will be open to any questions that I hopefully will be able to answer in this just a short time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I always so appreciate Governor Reilly's perspective on these resources around the Southwest and these really sacred cultural landscapes. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Paul Reed, who is a preservation archaeologist with Archaeology Southwest, and he is also based in Taos, a neighbor of mine. For the past 6 years, Paul has worked to protect the greater Chaco landscape from the effects of expanded oil and gas development associated with fracking. Through a series of meetings and forums, Archaeology Southwest and its partners have focused on expanding protections to sites, traditional cultural places, and fragile landscapes in the greater San Juan Basin. Paul will speak about the threats to Chaco, especially from the proposed Bureau of Land Management oil and gas leasing in the San Juan Basin and the likely impacts that such development will have. Here's Paul.
Thank you, Ernie. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for tuning in to this webinar, and I want to thank US Comos for putting this on, and the National Parks and Conservation with Ernie's great leadership getting this going. As Ernie said, I'm a preservation archaeologist with Tucson-based Archaeology Southwest. I have been fortunate to have worked around Chaco for more than 30 years now. I have actually worked in the field, on the ground, in every direction around Chaco. And I've spent many weeks wandering around Chaco itself. I also greatly appreciate Governor Reilly's comments and his statement. Akama Pueblo, I'm happy to say, has been one of our partners in some of the work that we've done. We have, at Archaeology Southwest, have recently expanded sort of the scope of our work and have focused much more on collaborating with descendant communities in the areas in which we work. I think it's safe to say this is the direction that archaeology, American archaeology, is taking and should continue to take. As Ernie noted, I want to speak to you this morning primarily about the threats that are facing Chaco Canyon. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. So I always start off when I am doing these presentations by showing Chaco Canyon and the descendant communities, the Pueblo communities, and the Navajo Nation that surround it. There's really no way to talk about the importance of Chaco without understanding the direct connections that Chaco has to the people who still live all around Chaco. So many times I think folks wrongly talk about Chaco as some kind of a vanished civilization. And that is, in my mind, the entirely wrong emphasis. Chaco is an amazing place that has direct connections to living people across the Southwest. And Chaco itself is a living place. And here I want to just throw up a map briefly that shows the extent of Chacoan sites across this large area. There are more than 300 sites that are affiliated with Chaco that are part of the greater Chaco landscape. Now, despite the protections that are tied to Chaco as a national park and in that status, there are many threats that are facing Chaco, and those mainly stem these days from oil and gas. Beginning in late 2011 and early 2012, oil companies—
Excuse me, Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your screen is not sharing, so we're not able to see the maps.
Okay, my apologies. I'm clicking, here we go. Okay.
There we go, thanks.
All right, sorry for the technical faux pas, folks. Let me roll back a little. Okay, so the map that I was wanting to be speaking about is Chaco and its context, surrounded by the current Pueblos in every direction except to the north. And then the map that I was just speaking about, this is what we think is a fairly good approximation of the Chacoan world. This is from AD 800 to 1200, more than 300 sites, again, spread across 4 modern states, and really just an amazing system of sites that went through different machinations and evolution through time, and then resulted with people living in the villages that you see here. So as the last few years have unfolded, oil and gas activity ramped up in the San Juan Basin, with unfortunately all of the effects that we are seeing. And this development has pushed closer and closer to the World Heritage Site at Chaco. Also want to point out that there are 7 additional sites that are part of that World Heritage designation that are spread across this entire map. So we have World Heritage sites in this entire area, not just at Chaco Canyon. Those sites, unfortunately, are outside the national park boundary. So we don't have protection for those sites beyond what various land managing agencies, BLM, BIA, Navajo Nation, et cetera, might put in place. So that's part of the threat that we're facing. The other issue is, as oil is produced from this Manco Shale formation, of course, methane or natural gas comes up as well. And because of, unfortunately, weak regulations that are in place, much of this gets burned off or it leaks out as methane, contributing to environmental problems in the region. And then the flares that are burned at night when wells are opened contribute to a decline in Chaco's dark skies. That is one of the values that Chaco has recently been recognized for in the last several years. We need to protect these dark skies. And this map is really in some ways horrifying to my point of view as we look at the spread of oil and gas. Now the magenta on the screen here shows the areas that are leased around Chaco. Chaco sits in the middle right in here. And it is protected, as you see, leases around Chaco, but existing leases all around, and basically this wave of magenta spreading to the south. This landscape, folks, right now is about 92% leased. So some of the things that we've talked about, Akama Pueblo has talked about, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, other tribes, all of our partners, is trying to protect larger areas around Chaco. So this is a map that shows the 10-mile zone of protection, which in this configuration passed the U.S. House as a bill last fall in October, went into the Senate, encountered some difficulties, and unfortunately is stuck there. We might see some movement in the future, but what we see is 10-mile zones of exclusion. If this were to become law, this would exclude oil and gas leasing on the BLM surface, about 25% of the land that you see within here. This would be a good start for protecting this area. Our state land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, in an executive order last year, removed about 80,000 acres of state trust land from this. So, we have a coalition of partners working towards this, and we really can protect Chaco, but we all have to stay vigilant and continue to work on this. What I want to do in just the minute or so that I have remaining is encourage folks listening. If you have concerns, you want to have your voices heard, comments are due to the Bureau of Land Management in Farmington and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, in the Gallup region. These comments are due by September 25th, so a couple of weeks from right now. And folks can go to the site protectchaco.org. We're going to put that up at the end of the webinar as well. We appreciate everyone's attention to this. Chaco is an amazing, irreplaceable resource, and we have tens of thousands of sites, archaeological sites, sacred sites that, as Governor Reilly said, are not easily recognized, that need protection across this landscape. We're also pushing the agencies to complete an ethnographic cultural study that got funded last year, but unfortunately the pandemic has slowed down. We are wanting, and the tribes are certainly wanting, to see those studies move forward before we get a final decision on oil and gas leasing in this critical area. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and any questions will be great when we do Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I assume my face is back up on the screen now. Yeah, I always, as well as Kurt's perspective from the traditional Pueblo world, Paul is truly a Chacoan scholar and knows that landscape as well as anyone. I'd like to start with a little bit about NPCA. Let me start sharing my screen. NPCA was founded in 1919 as a citizen advocacy voice to protect parks, and really to protect the revolutionary new idea of a national public park system. Imperfect as it is, there was nothing like it. And increasingly, we work to protect the lands and resources surrounding and connected to those parks. You have a sense of what an important and very special landscape we were talking about and what is at risk now. And I'm going to get into a little bit about what we can do about the impacts of this oil and gas development. Since my first visit to Chaco Canyon in 1981, I have seen that landscape terribly altered and impacted by a spider web of roads and well pads, pump jacks, processing facilities, noisy, heavy vehicles and trucks rolling along these rural roads, kicking up dust. What was once the center of a vast Puebloan culture in the Southwest is turning into an industrialized landscape. This is a different version of the map that Paul showed. You can see the park there on the bottom of the screen. And each black dot represents an active oil or gas well. So this is what it looks like near the park. And as we expand out to the rest of the region, this is what we were talking about. And these are just the active wells. It doesn't even include all the many leases that have not been developed yet. During this administration's energy dominance policy, the conservation and historic preservation community has been scrambling every 3 months to respond to quarterly lease sales on this landscape. It's just been an onslaught. There are not only aesthetic and resource impacts, but serious health and safety issues that are affecting a very vulnerable local Navajo population. With the threats to this incomparable cultural landscape that is sacred to numerous tribes, the public health and environmental justice issues, and the threats to the park itself, Chaco has become one of NPCA's most important protection campaigns over the past few years. The core group we have been working with includes Archaeology Southwest, National Audubon Society, National Wildlife Federation, New Mexico Wild, New Mexico Wildlife Federation, the Wilderness Society, U.S. Ecomos, the Coalition to Protect America's Parks, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I'm sorry about that long-winded list, but that's just a few of the folks we work most closely with. Just about every other conservation or preservation organization you can imagine is also involved because it's such an important place. And most importantly, we've worked closely with the All Pueblo Council of Governors, as Paul has mentioned, as well as Akama Pueblo. And the APCG, All Pueblo Council, has really provided strong leadership that we follow and support. And as well, we work with Navajo allies who live in the area. And these are the people and communities who are really at ground zero for the negative impacts. Paul mentioned the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act, which would permanently protect about 316,000 acres of BLM land within that 10-mile protection zone. And there has been a tremendous amount of support and momentum around that bill, including an historic alliance between the All Pueblo Council and the Navajo Nation President's Office. Paul also mentioned that the State Land Commissioner placed a moratorium on leasing state lands within that protection zone. And following that lead, Secretary of Interior David Bernhardt last year placed a 1-year leasing moratorium on BLM lands within the zone. However, that expired in May. And there have been other legislative attempts to extend the moratorium and to temporarily prohibit the use of federal funds to approve oil and gas projects until the ethnographic study that Paul mentioned is completed. Meanwhile, BLM has been working on a resource management plan. We have been waiting for this draft plan for literally years. And it was finally released for a 90-day comment period at the end of February this year, just around the time that COVID struck. The preferred alternative in the draft could potentially allow leasing and drilling right up to the boundary of the park. Imagine the noise and the disruption and the bright lights obscuring this world famous starry nights in this international dark sky park. Then of course, soon after the plan was released, COVID was running rampant, and the neighboring Navajo Nation, as well as Pueblo communities in particular, were hit very hard and focused more on protecting the health of tribal members. BLM planned a series of virtual meetings in May, but many tribal member stakeholders do not have reliable internet access or even cell service, not to mention that these kind of virtual meetings are really not culturally appropriate for traditional communities who are accustomed to meeting in person. So it was really, I think, a farce of public participation. All the tribes, the entire congressional delegation, our state government, conservation groups, we were all clamoring for an extension to the comment period. And at the last minute in late May, Secretary Bernhardt granted a 120-day extension. So now we are looking at a September 25th comment deadline coming up. But we are asking again for a total pause to the process until we are over this pandemic and can safely convene public in-person meetings. For now, we are advocating for alternative B1 at a minimum, which comes closest to protecting the 10-mile protection area. But we really feel that the plan is so deficient in its analysis of the impacts that BLM needs to revise the entire thing. So please comment. I'll echo what both Kurt and Paul said. Please comment before the September 25th deadline. This really could be our last chance to save one of the most important cultural landscapes in the US. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And at this point, I would like to invite Paul and Kurt to get back on the screen, and we can entertain some questions from the audience. Let me. Okay, Paul and Kurt, you're both there. And Kurt, I think, there you go. Great, well, I've got a few questions that have been posed here, so let me read this first one. The present cultural resources management is dominated by non-native archaeologists who are the principal beneficiaries, both in terms of knowledge and economics. Descendant communities, in comparison, are largely relegated to a secondary role. What do panelists believe is needed to empower Indigenous communities as active and equal participants in the response and informed identification, description, and assessment of cultural resources which are important to their respective histories and identities? A very, very good comment and question. And I'll just weigh in quickly that Paul mentioned that there is more and more an effort in the archaeological community to collaborate with traditional descendant communities, and I think that that's happening more and more. NPCA follows the lead of NPCA on this particular campaign, and I'm sorry, the All Pueblo Council. We follow the lead of All Pueblo Council on this particular campaign, as well as something else we're working on in Southeast Utah. And with that, let me hand it over first to Governor Reilly, if you'd like to take a stab at that question.
Well, thank you for that question. I know a little bit about some of the history of the lack of involvement, I guess, from descendant communities as they're referred to. As a private citizen, before I was appointed to serve as, first of all, second lieutenant governor and then governor, these types of concerns, the members of the community very rarely heard of unless it was provided by the tribal council or their leadership at public meetings. But once you get in office, you're inundated with everything from barking dogs to asked to testify in front of federal panels. On this particular issue, Akama has had a lot of experience in what we believe should be the model of how descendant communities across the country should be allowed to participate. Our first experience was on our own lands, as a matter of fact. We had been asked to look at a proposal for a CO2 gas line to cross the Akama Reservation connecting Arizona and Texas. And so we decided that that was of economic development, but how do we preserve the land that we have jurisdiction over, but more importantly, all the cultural sites that could lie between these starting points and ending points crossing a reservation. So what we did is we asked our cultural leaders who have had vast experiences almost on a daily basis visiting these sites to actually get on the ground and walk the land, much like a search grid. And so they did. And they identified all of the cultural sites that they could and had them reviewed and agreed upon. In the end, they developed a pathway for a possible CO2 gas line to go through the reservation without impacting any archaeological sites, any sacred sites, any pilgrimage trails, any type of cultural site, whether it be a culturally modified tree as a landmark. So we had experience with that. We took that same experience to the BLM and said, we could do this with your assistance, with your concurrence, as a trial. One of the hardest things that I learned when I was in office is that all these federal rules and regulations such as exist will not stop any development, unfortunately. And our only means of being able to communicate the need to protect our cultural resources is through such as presented, the Resource Management Plan, taking into account the National Historic Preservation Act. And that's what we've used in the past with some success. It's not a guarantee, but it at least is an opportunity to be at the table. Unfortunately, this administration has watered that down to a point where everything is fast-tracked. It's not kept in a logical sequence that we have been used to. And as Ernie alluded to, these lease sales are coming quarterly. The first lease sale that Akama got involved with, I was still in office, and we proceeded to follow our normal process, and we went on a travel trip back to Washington, and that's when we were informed that this is the first of a proposed lease sale, and they will be coming quarterly. And we were shocked because most pueblos do not have the capacity, they don't have the staff, they don't have the financial resources, much less the legal fees, resources to address these issues every 3 months. And so we were at a loss. So there are ways that we can work together if given the opportunity opportunity to use our cultural experts to do the same thing, to walk the land, to identify possible cultural sites that we would like to protect. And we could tell federal authorities to say, you cannot lease this parcel. It has too many cultural sites that we want to protect. Or we could say, we agree that this particular parcel has no cultural sites. And we would be open for you to further development. However, taking into account, the night skies, the smell of methane being burned or released, all of these other things, at least we would be at the table. So the Pueblos have had proposals before BLM, and we've made our case, but even though we've felt like we made strong a case for deferment and to take some of these parcels off, BLM continues to move forward and with their energy dominance agenda. And so many of these sites that Akama has been involved with on another federal project on Navajo Nation, many of these sites haven't been identified or excavated. So we agree that archaeology looks for solid remnants of buildings or potsherds or other things, but only our cultural experts, unique to each tribe, can identify their sacred sites. I cannot identify sacred sites for Navajo Nation or the Ute tribe. We can only identify cultural sites that are unique as Akama sees them for Akama cultural sites. So we would love to work in partnership, and we have, with people like Archaeology Southwest on these types of issues, but we have not been given the opportunity to do what we think is best in our best interest. I hope that answers the question. I tried to be as brief as I could.
Yeah, thank you very much. Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I appreciate Governor Reilly's comments. I think we're seeing more and more native-owned, archaeologically based companies. I know that Zuni has a program that does archaeology off Zuni lands and off Zuni lands. The Hopi have a program. They've had some cuts lately. The Navajo Nation has an archaeology program and a heritage program, as well as many private companies owned by Navajo individuals who do work. But I agree with the commenter that we need to work harder to, get some of the Anglo non-native companies out of the way and get native folks in doing this work. And as Kurt said, so many of these sites, I can't identify them with my experience in archaeology. We need experts from each group to be on the landscape identifying sites. And that's the future that I'm trying to work towards and where we need to go.
Right. Great. Thank you. And, there's just such rich oral history too that archaeology is just starting to integrate into some of its research. The next question here, this person says, Kurt mentioned comments being taken by the BLM and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Do we need to submit our comments to both? If you could submit to one or the other, and all the comments will end up in the same place. So that was an easy one. Thank you. What environmental impact statements have been done? The draft resource management plan amendment is written as a draft environmental impact statement. So that's the state of the current landscape planning for the area. So this resource management plan covers the entire Farmington field office of the Bureau of Land Management, which surrounds Choco. So that's, I think that basically answers that question. It is essentially an EIS in draft form at this point. And another quick and easy question, is there a bill pending in the US Senate? And if so, what is the number? And yes, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act, and it is Senate Bill 1079. 1079. But as Paul mentioned, it's essentially dead at the moment for a number of complicated political reasons. But it may be revived in the next administration or the next Congress. We'll just have to wait and see how that all goes. And here's another good question. Has the New Mexico BLM director shown any sympathy toward protecting the area near Chaco, either for archaeology, sacredness, or recreation? In Utah, a concerted effort by the local county municipal governments convinced the Utah director to pull over 80,000 acres near Arches Canyonlands and Bears Ears from a September lease sale. Is there a local coalition doing the same for this auction? So, Paul, can I kick that one over to you?
Yeah, I think that it's been a complicated situation. So we are on, I believe, our 6th New Mexico BLM state director currently. And this honestly has been, I think a policy pursued to have different individuals in these positions. And we're also on our 7th Farmington District BLM director. So we've kind of had a changing cast of characters, and our organization, APCG, our partners, we've all tried really hard to stay in touch with BLM on this. I don't personally think that there's a great deal of sympathy in the state office towards many of these concerns. I think in the local office with some of the archaeologists and the cultural people and some of the staff there, that they're a little more tuned into what's happening locally. But, I think what we really need to keep in mind is for the last 3.5 years, almost 3 3/4 years, these projects, these resource management plans, the EISs have been directed from Washington, D.C. And frequently local decisions have been overridden. State directors certainly have a role to play. And I, acknowledge that the Utah state director, as mentioned in the question, was able to pull some acreage. And we've had leases proposed near Choco that have been put in and pulled out by the state director or the local folks. But, these processes are driven by Washington, D.C. So there's only so much that anyone in the BLM locally can do to affect this. And I think in New Mexico, we have special heritage. Secretary Bernhard recognized this when, as Ernie said, he put a year's moratorium in place in July of last year. That was recently lifted. We got federal money to do a cultural study. We are still pushing, as Ernie noted, to get the deadline extended indefinitely and to get us through this pandemic, get the tribal studies done that are critical to understanding this landscape. So I don't personally see a ton of support for that at the state level.
Right. Thanks, Paul. And I'll say we were very involved in that deferral of those 80,000 plus acres in Southeast Utah. And though the announcement came from the state director, we are pretty sure that was directed. It came down from the Department of Interior in Washington because of political pressure from the governor of Utah. This next question, I think I'll pass this one to Kurt. Do all lease bonus payments and mineral revenues go to the federal government, or is it shared with the local population and or other stakeholders, including Pueblo communities?
I cannot honestly answer that question because most of the Pueblos that I know of, I would venture to say all of the Pueblos, do not have any oil or gas development on their lands. This area that we're talking about in Chaco, primarily Navajo Nation land and Navajo Alati land. They do receive royalties from those extractive industries. And maybe Paul might be able to answer this question about the leasing process, but actually leasing a parcel is pretty cheap, these oil and gas companies. It's only when they begin extracting oil or gas do they receive really the investment back on, but they recoup that immediately almost. Yes, they have to invest in infrastructure and equipment and pipes and such, but I think that their profits are more or less gauged by how much oil and gas they can sell. Right now, the market is pretty low. We all hear on the news that, you know, ships are just anchored in bays because they can't offload their product onto the refineries because the refinery holding tanks are full. So it's really, I can't answer that question, but I think that, you know, you would have to turn to Navajo Nation and their allottees to ask that question. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, the money that goes to the feds does not stay locally. It just goes into the pool, and then, you know, money comes back to our state through different federal appropriation. For individual allottees and the families and all the people on an allotment, that's their money, and they, you know, use it as they see fit. I don't think Navajo Nation has any trust lands that are currently leased in Greater Chaco. On their own reservation, I think there's some oil and gas activity. So my short answer is very little of this money comes back to local communities, and I think that's one of the problems we have in this country is local communities bear the brunt of different development, mining activities, oil and gas, other developments, and they reap very little, very few of the rewards in terms of money back into the communities.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Here's another question, and I think I'll direct this one to you, Paul. Are there any recent precedents for enlarging protection zones around Native American cultural and sacred landscapes based on the same principles and issues when oil and gas leases are involved? And I think this is referring to something like the archaeological protection zone proposed for the park.
No, I'm not aware of any other areas that have gone through the federal legislative process to provide protection. Now, of course, monuments can be proposed at any time by a president. President Obama set aside Bears Ears. You know, we had reductions under the current administration. So no, I think what we're trying to do around Chaco is a fairly unique prospect. Now, we could also recommend that areas go into wilderness, and that would provide protection. But specifically, you know, we don't see a whole lot of movement, you know, in the Congress to protect areas that are important to indigenous communities, to tribal communities. And again, I think this is a big shortcoming in the way we're pursuing this. So I would like to see more of this. If we could get the Chaco Protection Zone through the Congress, I think that would potentially open the door to protect additional areas.
So we're running short on time. I'm going to skip down to a different question here. What is the potential role of World Heritage in this issue, particularly since the World Heritage Site includes not only Chaco Culture National Historical Park, but also Aztec Ruins National Monument and several BLM properties between the two NPS locations? Paul, do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the fact that Chaco is a World Heritage Site is hugely important in all this. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to go to a conference last fall of the U.S. The Comos group and talk about Chaco and its importance. And so I think this is something that all of us wanting to protect Chaco need to pump up every single time we talk about it. You know, we only have 20 World Heritage Sites, or 22 in the country. We have 3 in New Mexico, and Chaco is one of those. So I think we should use this to the full advantage to do it. Unfortunately, again, you know, the current administration has backed away from World Heritage concerns, and you know, that's something that I don't think we can afford to do. I think this heritage is far too important to the Pueblo descendants, the other communities, and to all of us.
All right, thank you. Well, as we're wrapping it up here, I wanted to thank you all for spending some time with us today to talk about this, you know, truly monumental World Heritage Site and the current. And again, please submit your comments on this draft resource management plan before the September 25th deadline. I think Ecomos will be sending out a follow-up email with all the contact information for comment submission. Kurt and Paul, any final words before we hand it back over to Doug?
Thank you, Ernie, and thank you everyone who is viewing this webinar. I just wanted to say on behalf of all the Pueblos, a big thank you. These are our ancestral lands. We still use them. They're still alive. We continue to pilgrimage to these sites, and we would ask only if you're inclined to please submit your comments based on what you've heard and do your own research of this area. But thank you very much for listening to what I had to say and for the presenters as well.
I want to echo Governor Reilly's thanks and encourage folks to stay active and involved in this issue. There are many questions we couldn't get to. I'm glad to go through some of those and put a page on our website at archaeologysouthwest.org if that helps address some of this. There was a couple of questions about contact, about letters. We're putting together a sample letter that folks could look at and use as a template. And yes, please contact New Mexico senators and legislators, representatives, congresspeople. Reach out to anyone, reach out to the BLM, the BIA with your concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will just echo also, this is just such a critical moment for such an important landscape, and all the help and support we can get will make a difference. And with that, I will hand it back over to Doug with a closing message. Thank you all.
Well, you know, I've been following this, I thought, pretty closely, but what I've learned as we put together this webinar and listening just now really brings home to me the severe threat that we're facing for Chaco Canyon and for the whole Chaco world. So I would like to thank you all for watching. And I do want to encourage you to stay involved with the issues that have been raised. I'd like to give my special thanks to our presenters, Ernie Atencio, Paul Reed, and Kurt Reilly. And I'd also like to thank our U.S. ICOMOS Vice President, Dusty Jarvis, who really organized and coordinated this webinar. And I thank those who worked behind the scenes to organize and execute the production, Nicole Urson and Zoe Long, who managed the technical aspect of the webinar. You'll see some information soon about ways to become a member of U.S. ICOMOS, and believe me, we're going to ramp up our efforts here on Chaco. And you should receive some additional information about this. And if you join, we hope that you'll be willing to take on board and continue monitoring the situations that we have been discussing today, and to act at the local and national level. And with this, we'd be very happy to hear from you and to help. I also encourage your support of Archaeology Southwest and the National Parks and Conservation Association. Thank you again. As Governor Kurt Reilly said, Chaco is not dead, it is alive. Let's keep it that way. Thank you all.